Hi all, so here's the final video for this week. It's an optional one. I'm just going to cover a few extra issues which weren't covered in the other videos. So these, I take it, one of the issues I'm going to be covering is kind of an extra one that's not covered in the textbook. I'll be doing these quite briefly just to give you an idea of them, but telling you about where you can follow up on these things. And the second one is it is mentioned in the textbook, and it's to do with the open past, but it ties in also with the discussion of the truth maker objection to presentism, which we spoke about last week, or was it a couple of weeks ago? So the first issue, so they're kind of connected, and the things that connect the two are in fact the notion of quantum mechanics. So I'm not actually going to really talk much about quantum mechanics except to say this, and this is going to be the important point, I suppose. When physics was first developed in some sort of a detail, so we've already seen it was Isaac Newton who did that. When we looked at the modern history of the philosophy of time, we looked at Newton's Principia Mathematica, or we looked at the scholium to that, the introduction to it. Newton laid down what he thought were the laws of nature, and he had very good reason to think they were the laws of nature. Experimentally at the time, every observation that was made seemed to fit with it, and it made predictions, highly accurate predictions about the future, and so on. But it turns out that Newton's laws weren't really the proper laws of nature, and in particular in 1905 Albert Einstein developed developed physics further with his theory of relativity, which we'll look at in a bit of detail in the final week. However, although Einstein's theory of relativity is now taken to be true in some sense, it again makes even more accurate predictions about the future, and when we find that we've now got we can make measurements with greater accuracy, we find that Newton's laws aren't exactly right, but Einstein's laws do get things exactly right. Despite that, there's another system of physics called quantum mechanics, which is in opposition to Einstein's theory of relativity. We'll talk more about this in the final week. We're not going to go into the full details of the views, but this is the basic point. From physics from Newton to Einstein, so when it was first developed, to Einstein's theory of relativity, it looked as though the laws of nature were deterministic. So I'll put this in, so we'll call this, it's called classical physics. So classical physics encompasses both Newtonian physics and, if you like, you can see Einstein's theory of relativity as a precisifying, making Newton's view more precise, and it's still in the realm of classical physics. Classical physics has deterministic laws of nature. What that means is simply that if you take the state of the world at any particular moment and apply the laws of nature, so the laws of nature are supposed to tell you how the universe will develop, it turns out that there's only one way in which the world can develop according to classical physics. However, the alternative system, quantum mechanics, has indeterministic laws, and this is really one of the main reasons why these two views are incompatible with each other. So indeterministic laws means simply that if you take the world, the state of the world at any particular moment, and apply the laws, it turns out that there's not one way things can develop, there's more than one way in which things can develop. There's a kind of indeterminacy in reality itself, a kind of, how we might say, a randomness built in to the nature of reality according to quantum mechanics. Now you might puzzle about this and think, well, how come we can have both systems of physics? And well, the answer is that classical physics deals with large scale things, so planets and rocks and macroscopic objects, whereas quantum mechanics is supposed to deal with the very, very small, when we zoom right in and look at the nature of the fundamental particles and how they behave. So there is some thought that, if we look at things at the macroscopic level, it appears at any rate to be deterministic because it follows the classical physics laws, the laws of Einstein's theory of relativity. But if we look at the very small, it looks as though, in fact, the world is indeterministic. So there's some reason to believe that quantum mechanics gets things right at the more fundamental level, and that in a sense reality at its most fundamental, physical reality, is indeterministic. It's not quite right to say that though, because as I've said, these two things are in fact in competition with each other. In a sense, they're incompatible. Nobody really knows how to fit these two things together, and it's an ongoing problem in physics. Alright, so it looks like, at any rate, to fit them together something's got to give. We've got to come up with a new theory which somehow incorporates the two of these systems, and nobody knows quite how to do that, and nobody knows whether the ultimate system that we come up with will end up being indeterministic or deterministic. But we're going to be entertaining the hypothesis, at any rate, that quantum mechanics is right. So it looks as though, to a certain degree, indeterminism doesn't really bleed up to the macroscopic level. So when we look at the macroscopic world, we don't notice, at any rate, this indeterminism. But according to quantum mechanics, it very well may do, and it may even have macroscopic effects that we just don't, as I just said, we don't notice that in fact it has macroscopic effects. And I'm going to be talking a bit about that. So we're going to be assuming for the moment, which we don't know whether it's true, but we're going to be assuming that if we get to the end of physics, we get to the end of science, we come up with the final theory, that it turns out that it is indeterministic in the way that quantum mechanics says that it is. So let's just delete that. Okay, so the first issue that I want to talk about, if we imagine that there's indeterminism in reality, in nature, is the issue of how then we are to picture the world. So as we've seen, or say time, as we've seen on the eternalist picture, at any rate, we just have a single timeline. It just flows from, so 2020's here. It just flows 2030, 2010, and so on in both directions. It just goes on. It's just all laid out there in a single line. So if we're existing here, the future is already laid out for us, and that was how we were considering what it means for the future to be alethically closed, that all the truths about the future are already laid out. Now, I should quickly, before I move on to the main point here, I should point out that there is also a thing in the textbook about there's an argument due to two philosophers, Barnes and Cameron, according to which, in fact, eternalism, this picture of eternalism where we've got a single line flowing from future to past and everything's laid out, is in fact consistent with the future being open. Now, I find their paper, Barnes and Cameron, utterly baffling. I don't really understand what they're talking about, so you can talk about this in 6.4 of the textbook, where I've outlined that view sympathetically, but I don't really think that it's right, so we're not really going to be talking about that. I, in the end, do think it is true that if eternalism, this picture of eternalism where the universe is laid out along a single line, I think that's incompatible with the future being open. I think it means that the future is closed. So there are some people who deny that, but I don't really understand their view. So, on this view then, as we've said, this eternalist view, the future is closed. Now, if we instead don't view, I'll put it like this, this kind of a way of picturing reality as a single line from past to future is probably more appropriately viewed in terms of classical physics. So it's the idea that given the state of the world in 2020, add the laws of nature, and look, a single line develops, and it's already there according to the eternalists. But if we move to the quantum mechanical picture, or the view that the laws of nature are indeterministic, such that the future could develop in more than one way, consistent with the laws of nature, there's an alternative way of picturing the world. And this alternative way has it like this. So maybe we need to know a bit more about the quantum mechanics, or a little bit added extra. When does the indeterminism enter the picture? And the answer is the indeterminism enters the picture when human mind, or when conscious beings make a decision, when they decide to do something. And at that point, it's supposed to be indeterminate what's going to happen. And on one interpretation of quantum mechanics, called the Everett interpretation, or the many worlds interpretation, what happens, in fact, is not that there's really any indeterminacy, but what happens is we get a split in reality. So I'm just going to draw two branches out from here, but you have to understand that, in fact, there are going to be, wow, indefinitely many branches coming out here. Yeah, by the way, I'm sort of skimming over a few details here. It's not exactly when human beings make, or conscious minds make a decision. It's actually whenever they make an observation. But we'll think about it in terms of making a decision. So, suppose at this point, here I am. This is 2020. And suppose I make a decision. I decide to go down the shops. Or right, put it this way. I'm thinking about whether to go down the shops, and it's possible that I'll make the decision to go down the shops and possible that I won't. So if I do make the decision to go down the shops, we can imagine that we get a branch coming off from now. So this is, what's the date today? The 19th of November 2020. And we get a branch coming off where I do go down the shops, and then the one where, if I don't decide to go down the shops, we get another branch coming up where I don't go down the shop. I'll just label that no shop, no shops. So here the thought is, okay, at this point I make a decision to go down the shops, or I don't make a decision to go down the shops. And in fact, although it's indeterminate which one of those is going to happen, we can view that indeterminacy as in fact being, in a sense, I make both decisions. So the world itself splits into the world in which I do make the decision to go down the shops and the world in which I make the decision not to go down the shops. So at this point we get this branch. And then of course there'll be further decisions made and further decisions made, and the world becomes a branching world. So again, you have to understand that each of these points there's going to be indefinitely many. I mean, it's a really complicated, dense branching structure. I'm just drawing few of these branches. So, okay, this is the picture then. Anytime more than one thing could happen, in fact, more than one thing does happen, but they happen down separate branches. The world splits into all these different ways of being, all these different, different branches. And on this view then, this is the Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics. It's not the only interpretation, but it's a very popular interpretation. And some physicists think that this is the way the world is. So, in fact, let's just bring this up. You can find out about this Everett interpretation, the many worlds interpretation by this guy Hugh Everett III, and you can just have a look. I mean, I wouldn't recommend reading. I mean, it gets extremely complicated. Wikipedia, for our purposes, is good enough for this. So if you're interested, just have a look at around at the. I mean, there is a Stanford entry on this as well, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and you can have a look at some of these things if you want. It does get quite complicated. It's not going to be necessary for you to do so, but if you want, they're there. Now, here's the question that I want to ask. If this is the correct picture of the world, which as I emphasised, some physicists think it really is how the world is, what do we say about whether the future is open or closed? Certainly, well, and what do we say about free will? Those are the two things. Now, I want to put forward the idea here that, in fact, if this is the way the world is, and we understand openness as alethic openness, if we remember what alethic openness is the idea that propositions about the future, put it in this way, propositions about the future are not true and not false, right? Well, okay, let's suppose I'm here in 2020 and let's consider a proposition about the future. Ben will go to the shops. There's our proposition, and we're considering it. So proposition of the future, so it's got to be at a time. So, propositions about the future are not now true and not now false, and they will become at one point. So we're considering from the perspective which is now, is this proposition true or false? Well, what do we say about that? Well, if we say that it's true, if it's true on all branches, which seems like the obvious thing to say, and it's false if it's false on all branches, because, if truth about the future is something like it has to be univocally true, that just means it's going to be true in all of the branches. Well, in this particular case, it's not true on all of the branches, and it's not false on all of the branches. It's true on this branch, for example, that I go to the shop, and it's false on this branch. And maybe that's one way of understanding the idea that it's indeterminate whether I will go to the shops, that it's true on some branches and not others. And I think that that means that this is right. It's not true and it's not false. So in fact, this proposition is alethically open. Alethically open. And therefore, on this view, my suggestion is that we ought to think about the future as being open. Okay. Even if the future is open on this view, though, does that give us free will? And here I'm not quite so sure. So if we understand free will in the first sense of the term, that I outlined in a previous video, which is to say that I've got free will if at any point when I do something it's possible for me not to do otherwise, well, okay, maybe we get free will because, if I choose, there's a sense in which I will indeed choose to go to the shops, a sense in which that's true. That is, there will be one branch, so there's a sense really in which I kind of split into two. I go down this branch and I also go down that branch, but these two versions of me don't know anything about the other version. So there's, well, can I exist on two branches or not? We'll talk more about these issues, by the way, next week. We're going to look at an idea of perdurance and endurance. We'll see. But okay, for now, let's just suppose that we can say there's a sense in which I go down both branches. And if I go down both branches, well, I am on this branch. I choose to go to the shops, and it was possible for me to choose to not to go to the shops, and that's the me on the other branch. But there's also another sense here in which, in fact, I kind of choose to go down both. It's not like, the laws are sort of deterministic in the sense that they're going to determine that there's a branch in which I go to the shops and the branch in which I don't. That's not the ordinary understanding of what it means for the laws to be deterministic. But there still seems to be, the me that goes down this branch looks like it's not really that at this point I chose to go down that branch. Can this version of me here say that I chose to come down this branch? Well, not really, because it just happened that branch occurred, and it happened that branch occurred. It's difficult to know what to say here, but at any rate, it does look still to me as if there's a problem with free will. In fact, more of a problem here perhaps than on the ordinary view. So I'm not giving any answers here. It's just not clear here whether I have free will if we take it in the second sense, the first sense of free will. Well, what about the second sense, according to which I have free will if I do what I want to do? Well, if I do decide to go down the shops, then it looks like that's what I want to do. So, on this view, well, I want to go to the shops, so off I go. And if I don't want to go to the shops, then off I go down that branch. So there's a sense in which no matter which desire I have, which desire becomes operative, which one I eventually settle on, I desire to get in the shop so I do, or I desire not to so I don't, both of them are fulfilled, and, well, perhaps that gives me free will, but then you've got the further difficulty here, which is to do with, well, how can I even identify that desire as mine if there's a world in which I have the desire to go to the shops, or a branch in which I have the desire to go in the shops and do go there, and the branch where I don't have it, and so don't go there. There's a sense in which both of those desires occur in me, and both of them are satisfied. What do we say about free will then? I don't have any ownership over these desires, it looks like, because none of them are kind of mine, because they both kind of arise and they both exist. Again, I'm not giving you an answer to this, I'm just raising this as interesting questions. I don't think really anybody's dealt with these questions in any kind of a detail. So, I don't know what to say about this issue. Here are some things to think about. That's all I'm going to say about this. I just wanted to make you aware that there is this view of the branching future, and yeah, it looks like it's problematic as well. Now, there are some people who have dealt with this idea in the literature. A slightly different. So the one I recommend you have a look at is by a guy called Storrs McCall, which I mentioned in the seminar to people. Oops, Storrs McCall, and he's got a paper called, where is it? Storrs McCall branching. Hang on. Oh, and you can follow up two-stage alternate possibilities. So yeah, to do with the Hugh Everett III, the collapse of the wave function. Interesting. I thought I'd find it easy enough. You can see that it's mentioned here. Oh. Laws of nature and branching spacetime. That's the one. Okay. So he discusses these issues. So if you're interested in this, chase down this article, Laws of Nature and Branching Spacetime. You can just find it by searching for it and clicking on it. And I think there is a version of the paper available. Yeah, okay. There we go. So you can have a look through that if you're interested in this, and you can see he's got these branches. So he discusses this. Alright, so there's the first issue that I wanted to talk about. The second issue is to do with the idea of the open past. Now, for this issue, I want to briefly return to the truth maker problem for presentism, which, if you remember, was the problem that, according to presentism, only the present time exists, only presently existing things exist. But then there's this truth maker principle that says, for any true proposition, there must be something in reality that grounds the truth of that proposition, and therefore presentists have a problem explaining what grounds the truth of past tense statements. So, for example, the statement that dinosaurs existed, which is true now, we ordinarily think, it looks as though presentists can't really give an explanation of its truth because, well, there's nothing in reality to make it true, right? On the other hand, eternalists can perfectly well explain why dinosaurs existed now is true, and that's because, well, the past exists, and if we go down the past, we'll find that there are dinosaurs, the actual physical things, out there, as it were, in the past. Alright. Now, there is a more radical view, however, and the more radical view is that the past doesn't, well, okay, it wants to tie, well, let me give it, it's known as anti-realism, well, one version of anti-realism which ties, it's associated with a guy called Michael Dummett. He's written a lot on this, and Michael Dummett has this view according to which truth cannot outstrip our evidence for truth. Okay, so it's a kind of logical positivist line. If you remember the logical positivists, they want to say that the meaning of a statement is given by its truth conditions, or a statement. The famous statement is a statement is meaningful if and only if it is verifiable or it is an analytic truth. And it's not quite anti-realism. It doesn't tie it to meaning, but what he ties it to truth. And he wants to say that the only notion of truth that makes sense, and I'm not going to go through his full argument for this, but he gives this argument, the only notion of truth that makes sense is one that ties it to evidence. So, in effect, if there is no evidence whatsoever for a particular proposition, then we can't hold that that proposition is true. Right. Now, that can give us some idea about the future, because about the open future. Because again, if we imagine that the quantum mechanical interpretation of the world is correct, then it's going to turn out that even if we knew everything about the world as it currently is, we're not going to know how the future will be, because it can go in many different ways. There are different possible ways in which the future can be. So we can't know perhaps whether there will be human outposts on Mars in 2100, because there are some possibilities where it's realised according to the laws of nature and some that it can't. So there can't be any evidence now that that will happen, right? There may be evidence, so the laws of nature might be such that we can predict tomorrow with certainty. So we can know there's plenty of good evidence that the sun will rise tomorrow. So it will give the idea that some aspects of the future are some. So take the two sentences. Take the sentence oops, what's happened there? The sun will rise tomorrow. It might be that we have evidence for that. So that one can come out as being true, right? Even though it's a future tense statement, that one is true because we've got evidence for it. But something like, there will be outposts on Mars. On Mars by 2020. Well, that one might be, well, if it's not true because we haven't got evidence for it. Well, hang on. I'm not stating this very well. His idea is not that a statement is false if we have no evidence for it, but that it's going to be neither true nor false. Yeah, so not true and not false. So we have some statements which are open and some which are closed. Okay, so that gives us this idea that the future is kind of partly settled. It's got some aspects of the future which are we can now say are there in some sense, or at least statements about them are true, whereas other statements are neither true nor false, and therefore the future is open. So you can imagine reality as having kind of gaps in it, truth value gaps. Okay, if this is the right way to think about the future, the point is, well, perhaps indeed that is the right way to think about the past. So perhaps, and Dummett indeed does take this line, he thinks that when we think about the past, there are some things that we've got perfectly good evidence, and evidence here can be historical. So there are some things about the past which are going to be true now. So the fact that dinosaurs existed, we have fossil evidence for it, and so on and so forth. So those are going to be facts about the past. It was the case that dinosaurs existed, true. But now consider some other facts or propositions about the past. Say Julius Caesar had, I can't remember how many hairs there were. I think we looked at how many hairs are roughly on people's head. Anyway, Julius Caesar had 5,000 hairs on his head on his 30th birthday. There just may be no evidence of that at all available now. And if the laws of nature are indeterministic, well, it turns out they're indeterministic both into the future and into the past. So even if we knew the full state of the world now, we still wouldn't be able to work out, as it were, whether Julius Caesar had 5,000 hairs on his head or not. So there's going to be no evidence available at all for whether Julius Caesar had 5,000 hairs on his head on his 30th birthday. Therefore, the past, it's going to be neither true nor false that Julius Caesar had 5,000 hairs on his head in the past. So again, on this kind of a view, just as we perhaps think about the future as being gappy, there are some facts about the future which are true, but then there are truth value gaps. There are some which are neither true nor false. The same is going to apply to the past. Right, that's a very odd and weird view to hold, but it has been held. So I'm just outlining, Michael Dummett here does think that that's probably the correct way of thinking about reality. We're apt to think about the past as being full, even if there are some things which we can now not get any evidence for, we still think that somehow those facts, they're either true or false. They can't be neither true nor false. Dummett denies that and thinks, in fact, it's a misconception of reality. So there we go. There's the Dummettian position. It's also explored in a slightly different way by a chap called Ned Markosian. So let's give you these references here. So the first one then, well, the first one, let's do Michael Dummett. So Michael Dummett, anti-realism about the past, and if you just Google that, you should be able to find, any of these will do. The anti-realists past. So this one is, yes, this one's explicitly focusing on this. Well, okay, yeah, no, it's a review of Dummett's book. Dummett has got a book called Truth in the Past, yeah. So Truth in the Past is the book if you want to find that. But basically, any of these entries here that you can find. So Dummett's Anti-Realism from Michael Devitt in 1983, and there's a Internet Encyclopedia. So there we go. So one about anti-realist about arithmetic and to say about the past. It'll explain these issues. So if you're interested, follow up by just looking up Michael Dummett, Anti-Realism about the past, and look at the references. The other one, Ned Markosian. So let's see if I can find that one. The Open Past, it's called. So if you Google that, you'll be able to find this article on the Open Past and find it. So okay. Yes, that was rather sketchy, those things, but again, on these issues, I'm really just trying to give you some, well, make you think about them, give you some thoughts, and you don't have to pursue these. This is an extra, added extra. None of this is going to be absolutely crucial for what follows in later weeks. So yeah, I hope that that's of some interest to some people.